The transport ship descended through layers of dead space, its engines cutting through the void like a knife through silk. Ryan had been given no choice in this assignment. The Galactic Imperium didn't offer choices to humans, a species they'd only contacted a few years ago, treated as barely more than animals who somehow learned to speak standard. When the orders came down to transfer him to Detention Station Omega-7, his commanding officer hadn't even bothered to explain why. Just handed him a data tablet, told him to keep his head down, and threw him onto the transport. Now, as Ryan stepped out of the docking bay, the station revealed itself in all its terrible glory. It was ancient, built from materials that seemed to absorb light itself. The walls were a deep, impossible black. Everything about it screamed wrongness. He'd read the briefing file during his journey, or tried to. Most of it was redacted. Black bars covered entire sections like scars across paper. What little remained legible was terrifying. One prisoner. One cell. For 3,821 years. Ryan made his way through the empty corridors. The station was largely automated, with just a skeleton crew of alien administrators who'd refused to even make eye contact with him. They'd handed him a uniform, showed him to a tiny quarters, and told him his job was simple. Feed the prisoner. That was it. Nothing more. Nothing complicated. Just push a cart with nutrient paste to the cell, load it into the feeder mechanism and walk away. Don't look at it, one of the administrators had said, his face covered in what looked like chitinous plates. Don't listen to anything it says. Don't make unnecessary sounds. These aren't suggestions, human. These are conditions of your survival. Ryan wanted to ask why they'd send someone to feed a prisoner if there was so much danger in actually being near it. But humans had learned quickly that asking too many questions around the Imperium got you labeled as troublesome. Troublesome humans tended to disappear. So he didn't ask. He just pushed the cart. The path to the detention block took him through sections of the station he assumed nobody visited anymore. The metal beneath his feet was dusty. Some of the corridor lights flickered weakly, casting everything in a sickly pale glow. There were older feeding systems along the walls, long since rusted over or stripped away. Ryan realized with a chill that those must have been the automatic systems. Something had changed. Something required an actual person to come down here now. The cell came into view gradually. It was separated from the corridor by a wall of reinforced transparent aluminum, though the material had been darkened so you couldn't see through it clearly. Instead of a window, there was just a small opening where the nutrient paste could be inserted into the feeder slot. Everything about the design was meant to prevent even accidental contact between the keeper and the kept. Ryan pushed the cart into position and reached for the container of paste. That's when he heard it. Purring. It wasn't like any sound Ryan had ever heard before. It wasn't loud or aggressive. It was deep and resonant, like something vibrating in his chest cavity. It filled the entire corridor. It was almost comforting. Almost warm. But underneath it was something else. Something that spoke of vast intelligence and patience worn thin by millennia of waiting. Against every single instruction he'd been given, Ryan looked up. The transparent aluminum had shifted somehow. Or maybe his eyes had adjusted to the darkness on the other side. Through the semi-translucent barrier he could make out a shape. Large. Feline. Impossibly graceful even in confinement. And then there were the eyes. They were luminous. Bright gold green, like twin suns filtered through deep water. They caught the weak corridor light and threw it back at him with an intelligence that made Ryan's breath catch. Those eyes weren't the eyes of an animal. They were aware. They were conscious. They were ancient beyond measure. And right now they were looking directly at him. More than looking. Seeing. Ryan felt something shift inside him like a door opening in his chest. He should look away. The protocol was clear. But he couldn't. Those eyes held him with a gravity stronger than any physical force. And in that moment, suspended between the rules he'd been given and something deeper inside himself, Ryan understood something fundamental. Whatever this creature was, it wasn't what he'd been told. It wasn't a monster waiting for feeding. It was a being. A person. Someone who had been alone in the dark for longer than human civilization had existed, waiting for another consciousness to acknowledge it. The purring continued, steady and patient. Ryan didn't look away. For the first time since arriving at the station, he made a choice that wasn't dictated by authority or fear. He chose to see. The first week was the hardest. Ryan came back to the cell every day pushing the same cart, loading the same nutrient paste and fighting every instinct telling him to run. The other station workers didn't question his routine. They were too busy avoiding this section of the station themselves. But Ryan knew they were watching through security feeds. He could feel it. So he played the part perfectly, Silent, mechanical, professional. In and out. Just like he was supposed to. But everything changed the moment he was alone. On the third day, when the corridor was empty and the automated systems hummed their lonely song through the walls, Ryan spoke. It was stupid. It violated everything. But he couldn't help himself. Can you hear me? His voice sounded small in the vast emptiness of the detention block. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the purring returned, louder this time. More deliberate. It wasn't threatening. It was almost like an answer. Like the creature was acknowledging that yes, it could hear him. Yes, it was listening. Over the next few weeks, Ryan developed a routine that would have gotten him executed if anyone discovered it. He'd come during his assigned shift, load the feeder as required, but then he'd linger. He'd sit down on the cold metal floor with his back against the darkened transparent aluminum and he'd talk. At first it was just random thoughts. Complaints about the food in the station. Questions about how the Imperium actually worked. Stories about Earth, about his life before all this, about his family who he'd left behind when the Imperium conscripted him into service. And slowly, impossibly, the creature began to respond. It started with sounds. Different patterns of purring. Low rumbles that seemed to carry meaning. Then came something else, a sound like wind through canyons but shaped, intentional. Ryan realized with a shock that it was trying to speak. It was struggling to form words in standard, the common language of the galaxy. The accent was strange, the pronunciation rough, like someone whose vocal cords were built for a completely different kind of speech. But the words were there. You come back. You come back. The voice was deep and resonant, each word separated by effort. Yeah, Ryan said, his own voice tight with emotion. I come back. Others did not. Others left me. Ryan felt something break inside his chest. This creature had been here for thousands of years, and in all that time, nobody had bothered to actually communicate with it. Nobody had treated it like anything more than a dangerous animal that needed feeding. On the 8th day, Ryan did something reckless. He accessed the station's restricted databases. His credentials were basic, just enough to perform his job, but humans had a talent for finding workarounds. It took him several nights of careful work, hiding his access trails, moving through the security systems like water finding cracks in a dam. What he found was locked behind layers of encryption and classified stamps that made his hands shake as he read them. The creature's real name was Kethra. Not the feline, or the prisoner, or any of the clinical terms used in the official reports. Kethra. It meant something in its own language, something that translated roughly to guardian of the threshold, or keeper of the sacred light. The records, even the ones that had been heavily redacted and edited, painted a picture that contradicted everything Ryan had been told. Kethra's species hadn't been conquered or captured. They'd been an allied civilization, peaceful and powerful, living on a world called Velcora 7 in the outer reaches of the galaxy. When the Imperium had begun its expansion, Kethra's people had welcomed them. They'd shared technology. They'd formed treaties. They'd believed in cooperation. Then the Imperium had demanded something Kethra's species couldn't give: complete submission. Not alliance. Not partnership. Subjugation. Kethra had refused. What happened next was written in dry, clinical language that barely concealed the horror beneath it. Kethra had defended its world against the Imperium's forces. Alone. Its entire species had retreated underground into deep crystal caverns, refusing to fight. But Kethra, the Guardian, had stood against fleets of warships. Against weapons designed to level continents. Against technology that should have pulverized any single being into dust. And Kethra had won. For 3 days it had fought, and the Imperium's forces had been forced to retreat. But winning a battle wasn't the same as winning the war. The Imperium's response was swift and terrible. They didn't destroy Kethra's world. They did something worse. They imprisoned the Guardian. They sealed its species underground with technology that prevented escape. And they locked Kethra away here, in this cell, on this dead station, left to rot in solitude. The official reason given was too dangerous for civilization. The real reason, Ryan understood now, was fear. That night, Ryan sat outside the cell and told Kethra what he'd learned. He read the documents out loud, translating the cold bureaucratic language into something human and real. "I'm sorry," Ryan said when he finished. "I'm sorry they did this to you." The purring stopped. For a long moment there was only silence. Then Kethra spoke, each word careful and deliberate. "You see me? You see truth. You human. But you different. You choose to see. This is rare. This is precious." And in that moment something fundamental shifted between them. They were no longer keeper and prisoner, human and alien, observer and observed. They were two conscious beings, separated by glass and fear and 3,000 years of institutional cruelty, finally recognizing each other as real. It started with a small mistake. Ryan had gotten careless, or maybe he'd just stopped caring about hiding. He'd spent so much time in the detention block, talking to Kethra, sharing information, learning about a civilization that the Imperium wanted erased from history, that he'd forgotten about the security cameras. Or maybe he'd just assumed no one was watching. He was wrong. Commander Vex arrived at the detention block on a day when Ryan wasn't scheduled to be there. The chitinous-faced administrator who'd first briefed him came with 2 armed guards. They found Ryan in the corridor outside Kethra's cell, sitting on the floor with his back against the darkened transparent aluminum, holding a piece of paper with Kethra's language written on it. The creature inside had been teaching him, slowly and patiently, how to read the symbols that looked like spirals and flowing water. "Step away from the cell," Commander Vex ordered. His voice was cold, precise, devoid of any emotion. Ryan stood up slowly, his mind already racing through possibilities. He knew this was coming. He'd always known it was coming. You couldn't break this many rules without consequences. But knowing something theoretically and facing it in reality were two completely different things. "The prisoner has been compromised," Vex continued, speaking into a communication device. "Prepare Termination Protocol 7. And get a cleanup team ready for the detention block." 2 terminations, Ryan realized. First Kethra. Then him. "Sir," Ryan said, keeping his voice steady and respectful, "I can explain." "There is nothing to explain," Vex interrupted. "You've been fraternizing with a Class Omega threat entity. This is treason against the Imperium. The penalty is immediate execution, and I have full authority to carry it out right here." Ryan's hands were shaking, but his mind had already shifted into a different mode. Humans had survived on Earth for millions of years through cunning, through adaptation, through the ability to see problems and find solutions that nobody else had considered. The Imperium had weapons and numbers and bureaucracy. But they didn't have what humans had. They didn't have the ability to think sideways, to find cracks in the system and exploit them. "There's a radiation leak in Sector 4, Ryan said suddenly. "I noticed it this morning. The sensors are showing abnormal readings. If you execute me here and the evacuation protocols aren't followed correctly, that contamination could spread through the entire station." It was a complete lie. Ryan had been all over this station in the past few weeks, and he'd never seen any sign of radiation. But Commander Vex hesitated. That was all Ryan needed. "You should probably check it before you kill anyone," Ryan continued, speaking quickly but calmly. "Just to be safe. I'd hate for the Imperium's records to show that you ignored a potential catastrophe." Vex's expression didn't change, but Ryan saw the calculation happening behind those cold alien eyes. The fear of failure, of being blamed for a station-wide disaster, was apparently a universal constant. The commander turned to one of the guards. "Verify those readings in Sector 4. Now." The guard hesitated. "Sir, the detention block protocol." "Now," Vex snapped. The guard left, and Ryan allowed himself a small breath. He'd bought time. Not much, maybe minutes, but in minutes you could do a lot if you were desperate enough. While the remaining guard kept his weapon trained on Ryan, and Vex waited for confirmation from Sector 4, Ryan's eyes flicked toward the wall panel that controlled the station's basic systems. It was visible just 30 feet away. He'd memorized its location weeks ago, during those long shifts when he'd had nothing to do but observe his surroundings. The guard's communication device crackled. The other guard was reporting back. No radiation leak. The sensors were normal. Vex's hand moved toward his weapon. Ryan moved. He wasn't faster than the guard, and he definitely wasn't stronger. But he was desperate, and desperate people do things that make no logical sense. He threw the piece of paper with Kethra's writing directly at the guard's face, a stupid, ineffective move that should have accomplished nothing. Except the guard flinched just for a second, and in that second Ryan was already moving. He ran toward the wall panel, not away from it. The guard fired, and the blast scorched the air where Ryan had been standing a moment before. Ryan hit the panel hard, and years of watching maintenance workers tinker with station systems paid off. He didn't need to understand the Imperium's technology perfectly. He just needed to know where to push. Alarms screamed to life throughout the detention block. Emergency lights flooded the corridor in shades of red and amber. Doors began to seal automatically. The guard was shouting, and Vex was moving toward Ryan with something that looked like a stun weapon, but the panic was already spreading. The station's artificial intelligence was running through its emergency protocols, and everything was chaos. In that chaos, Ryan did the only thing he could do. He ran toward Kethra's cell. "I'm getting you out," he gasped, hands flying across the control panel. He could see Kethra now, the luminous eyes watching him from behind the darkened transparent aluminum. The creature understood what was happening. It understood that this moment mattered. "Codes," Ryan muttered, fingers dancing across the interface. "I need the access codes." Behind him, Commander Vex was shouting orders. The second guard was moving to intercept him. But Ryan had spent weeks in this station, learning its rhythms, understanding its systems. And more than that, he had something the Imperium's forces didn't have. He had someone inside the system who wanted to escape. Kethra's voice filled the corridor, a deep rumbling sound that resonated through the metal. The creature was somehow communicating with the station's systems directly, overriding protocols that should have been impossible to bypass. The cell door began to slide open. Ryan turned to face Vex and the guard, putting himself between them and the emerging Guardian. "You can shoot me," Ryan said, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. "But you can't kill what's already been freed." The cell door slid all the way open. The moment the cell door fully opened, Commander Vex fired. The stun bolt was meant for Ryan, but Kethra moved with a speed that seemed impossible for something so large. The Guardian stepped forward, and the bolt that would have dropped Ryan to his knees harmlessly dissipated against Kethra's fur. There was no violence in the movement. No aggression. Just a simple, elegant act of protection. "Run," Kethra said, its voice carrying harmonics that made the station's metal walls vibrate. Ryan didn't need to be told twice. He bolted down the corridor, and Kethra moved beside him with surprising grace. The Guardian wasn't attacking the guards or the commander. It was simply moving them aside with the casual strength of a being that had been confined for 38 centuries and now found itself in a space wider than a cell. The guards scattered, more terrified than they'd ever been in their lives. Whatever they'd been trained to expect from their prisoner, it wasn't this. It wasn't a creature that moved with such control, such dignity. The emergency protocols that Ryan had triggered were still active, doors sealing and unsealing in chaotic patterns as the station's artificial intelligence tried to contain what it perceived as a breach. But Kethra seemed to understand the station's systems instinctively. The Guardian would pause at certain junctures, and doors would slide open moments before they reached them. Ryan realized with a start that Kethra was communicating with the station's network the same way it had with the cell's controls. Whatever technology the Imperium had used to contain this being, Kethra had spent 3,000 years learning how to talk to it. They burst into the docking bay, and Ryan's mind locked onto the solution immediately. A small courier shuttle sat in the third bay, its engines already warm from a recent maintenance cycle. He'd passed it 100 times during his weeks on the station. The security protocols would be simpler than the larger ships. Humans had a gift for identifying the weak points in systems, for seeing the quick way through instead of the intended path. "This way," Ryan urged, leading Kethra toward the shuttle. Behind them, alarms continued to wail. Security forces were mobilizing, but they were moving with confusion, unsure of what they were actually trying to contain. The station's emergency protocols were fighting against Kethra's interaction with the systems, creating a digital storm that made everything harder to coordinate. They reached the shuttle, and Ryan's fingers flew across the access panel. The security lock was older than he'd hoped, which meant it was simpler than he'd feared. 3 layers of authentication, each one easier to bypass than the last when you understood that security was often just a suggestion that people had learned not to question. The shuttle's ramp descended just as the first security team rounded the corner, weapons raised. But they hesitated. How do you shoot at something that has just saved you from your own government's lies? How do you pull a trigger when you've started to understand, in some small way, that everything you've believed might be wrong? Kethra paused at the ramp and looked back at those guards for a moment. The Guardian's luminous eyes met each of them in turn, and something passed between them, a message without words. Not a threat. A question. A suggestion that they might want to reconsider who the real enemy was. Then Kethra was inside the shuttle, and Ryan was sealing the ramp behind them. "Can you fly this?" Kethra asked as Ryan threw himself into the pilot's seat. "No idea," Ryan admitted, his hands already working the controls. "But I'm going to learn fast." The shuttle's systems hummed to life. Ryan pushed the throttles forward, and the small craft lurched away from the docking clamps with a screech of metal that echoed through the bay. Through the viewport, he could see security teams scrambling, weapons firing uselessly at a ship that was already accelerating toward the launch tunnel. Then they were through, and behind them, Detention Station Omega-7 receded into the black void like a monument to injustice. But Kethra wasn't finished. The Guardian's paws moved across the shuttle's communications console with surprising dexterity. The creature's fingers, Ryan realized, were more flexible than he'd given them credit for. More adaptable. Kethra began inputting sequences, accessing frequencies that Ryan hadn't even known existed. The shuttle's communication system, freed from the station's restrictions, began broadcasting. A message filled every channel, every frequency, every communication band that the Imperium monitored. And it wasn't just words. Kethra broadcast the entire archive. 3,000 years of records. The treaty with Velcora 7. The demands for subjugation. The refusal. The battle. The imprisonment. The erasure. Documents that the Imperium had buried so deep they thought no one would ever find them. Videos of Kethra's species living in peace before the conquest. Testimony from beings who had witnessed the truth and been silenced. And threaded through it all was something else. The voice of Kethra speaking directly to the billions of beings across the galaxy. Not in anger. Not in calls for revenge. But in simple, devastating honesty about what the Imperium had done. About what it meant to imprison a Guardian for refusing to bow. About what it meant to erase a civilization from history because they valued freedom more than servitude. The message spread like fire through subspace channels. From station to station. From world to world. Across systems that the Imperium thought it controlled absolutely. Ryan watched the communication feed spike as the broadcast reached its first million recipients. Then 10 million. Then a billion. Entire populations suddenly learning the truth about the government that ruled them. Entire military forces discovering that the enemy they'd been told to fear was actually a victim. Entire worlds beginning to question whether they wanted to be part of an empire built on lies. They will come after us, Kethra said calmly, watching the stars streak past. Yeah, Ryan agreed. They definitely will. But they cannot silence this now, the Guardian continued. The truth is spreading. Like seeds on the wind. Like light breaking through darkness. Ryan looked at the being beside him. The creature that had been alone for 38 centuries, that had waited patiently for someone to see it as more than a monster, that had somehow found the strength to forgive rather than destroy. What do we do now? Ryan asked. Kethra's eyes glowed brighter, luminous with something that might have been hope. Now we run, the Guardian said. And the galaxy runs with us. 3 years. It was remarkable how much the galaxy could change in such a short span of time, yet how some things remained fundamentally the same. Ryan stood on the highest cliff of Velcora 7, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of amber and deep crimson. Beside him, Kethra's massive form was silhouetted against the dying light, the Guardian's fur rippling gently in the wind that carried the scent of alien flowers and something that reminded Ryan of home, though he couldn't quite place what home smelled like anymore. The journey from that stolen shuttle to this moment had been anything but straightforward. The first year after the broadcast was chaos. The Imperium didn't collapse overnight. Empires that had ruled for millennia didn't simply vanish because one message went viral across the galaxy. But something fundamental had broken inside it. The message had awakened something that had been dormant in billions of beings: doubt. The question of whether obedience was really the same as loyalty. Whether security built on lies was actually security at all. Military forces began to fracture. Soldiers who had joined the Imperium believing they were protecting civilization suddenly discovered they'd been enforcing subjugation. Some remained loyal to the old order out of fear or habit. But others didn't. Entire fleets switched allegiance. Entire planets declared independence. Within 6 months, the Imperium controlled less than half the territory it once had. By the end of the first year, the Celestial Imperium had ceased to exist as a unified power. It wasn't destruction or conquest that toppled it. It was truth. Truth spread like the most unstoppable force in the universe because truth didn't need weapons or armies. It just needed to be heard. Ryan's role in all of this had evolved in ways he never could have predicted. He'd become, against all odds, a bridge between species. A human who had dared to see an alien prisoner as a person rather than a monster. The Imperium, in their arrogance, had assumed that humans were too simple, too primitive to understand the complexities of galactic politics. But simplicity had turned out to be exactly what was needed. Ryan didn't think in terms of faction politics or strategic advantage. He thought in terms of what was right and what was wrong. And that kind of clarity was revolutionary. In the second year, Kethra's people emerged from the crystal caverns where they'd been hiding for centuries. The Guardian had led them out personally, and the reunion had been something Ryan had been privileged to witness. Thousands of Kethra's kind, beings of grace and intelligence and profound sadness, stepping into sunlight for the first time in generations. They hadn't asked for revenge against the Imperium. They'd asked for the freedom to rebuild. To remember who they were before the conquest. To reclaim their history and their identity. And the galaxy, watching through news feeds and broadcasts and personal accounts, began to understand something fundamental about what compassion actually meant. It wasn't weakness. It wasn't naivety. It was strength. The kind of strength that could endure 38 centuries of imprisonment and still choose mercy over vengeance. By the third year, new governments had begun to form. Not empires. Alliances. Federations of free worlds that made decisions together rather than having them imposed from above. It was messier than the old Imperium had been. There was more debate, more disagreement, more inefficiency. But there was also something the Imperium had never had, legitimacy born from consent rather than coercion. And humans, those primitive creatures that the Imperium had barely acknowledged, found themselves playing an unexpected role in this new order. They were mediators. Translators not just of language but of perspective. They understood struggle and survival in ways that older, more established species had forgotten. They carried within them a kind of stubborn hope that seemed to resonate with beings who had been crushed under imperial rule for so long. Ryan had been offered positions of power multiple times. Ambassador positions. Seats on the new Federation Council. He'd turned them all down. Instead, he'd chosen to stay with Kethra. "Do you regret it?" Kethra asked now, as if reading his thoughts. The Guardian turned its massive head to look at him, those luminous eyes reflecting the last rays of sunlight. "Leaving your people to follow me?" "No," Ryan said simply. He reached up and placed his hand on Kethra's neck, feeling the warmth of the Guardian's fur, the strong pulse beneath it. "My people are out there building something new. But you were alone. Someone needed to make sure you weren't alone anymore." Kethra began to purr, that deep resonant sound that Ryan had first heard so many years ago, in a corridor on a station that no longer served any purpose. The Imperium had abandoned Detention Station Omega-7 once the truth came out. It orbited the dead star now as a monument, a reminder of what happened when governments forgot that the beings they governed were actually people. "The young ones are asking about you," Kethra said. "The next generation. They want to know about the human who helped free the galaxy. They think you're a myth." Ryan laughed. "I'm about as far from a myth as you can get. I'm just someone who saw another being and decided they were worth saving." "Exactly," Kethra said. "In a galaxy full of weapons and strategies and empires and conquest, you offered something simpler. You offered recognition. You offered the choice to see another consciousness as real and worthy of dignity. That is not a simple thing. That is the rarest thing in the universe." They stood together as the last light faded from the sky and stars began to emerge overhead. In the distance, lights from the new city flickered to life. A settlement being built by Kethra's people and humans and a dozen other species working together. No walls. No hierarchies. Just beings trying to figure out how to exist alongside each other. Ryan thought about the journey that had brought him here. From a human barely acknowledged by galactic civilization. To a prisoner tending station. To someone who had helped reshape the entire structure of power in this corner of space. It seemed impossible. But then again, the most powerful thing in the universe often started with something simple. One person seeing another truly. One person refusing to look away. One moment where compassion mattered more than protocol. The Celestial Imperium had fallen not because humans were warriors or conquerors. It had fallen because humans understood something fundamental about existence that older, more established civilizations had forgotten. That every being mattered. That dignity wasn't something given by those in power, it was something inherent in consciousness itself. And that, Ryan realized as he watched the stars multiply across the darkening sky, was the real revolution. Not conquest. Recognition. Not domination. Compassion. The galaxy was learning to see itself through new eyes. And somehow, a human from a planet nobody had heard of had helped make that possible. Beside him, Kethra's purring continued into the night, a sound of peace that 3,000 years of imprisonment had somehow failed to silence.